Happy Halloween, my loves! In celebration, I'ma offer you some quick Ronica lore. Yay, you definitely need this. As a kid, one of my favourite movies was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was a fun cosmic romp based on a book, or based on a TV show, whichever came first. But what I liked most about it— oh wait, there's also a comic book. But what I liked most about it wasn't the sense of adventure, or the larger-than-life characters, or the incredibly sharp wit and comedic focus. No, it was the Vogons. I utterly adored these potato-shaped alien bureaucrats, and honestly, I still do. Something about their faces, the odd proportions, and the dress sense really spoke to me. As an adult, I think I loved the Little Nightmares franchise so much because these vaguely human monsters kinda remind me of Vogons a lot of the time. Also, in the movie, there's this line: they can't think, they can't imagine, most of them can't even spell, they just run things, which feels like it applies to a lot of the creatures we end up against in this odd little game series. I couldn't tell you why most of the monsters do what they do, I couldn't tell you what drives them to do their day jobs, or even chase us, other than it's what they do and that's the entire reason. Sure, some monsters on top seem to have some idea and some organisational structure, but most of them just seem to do the things they do because these are the things they do. And there we go, some weird Ronica lore for you that sort of kinda ties into what we're talking about today, but not really. If you've been here a while, then you'll know that Little Nightmares is one of my favourite game franchises. These small horror platformer stroke puzzle games just hit me right in the dopamine receptors. I've even very much enjoyed the mobile spin-off Very Little Nightmares, which yes, did lose something because of the graphical changes and differing approach to gameplay, but I think it definitely made a case for mobile games being able to be just as engaging as console games, even with their limitations. The point is, I absolutely love this franchise, so I was excited to hear of a third Little Nightmares game in development, although slightly cautious, because after all, it is the third game in a series, and naturally, after a franchise goes on for long enough, you can reasonably expect it to not be firing at all cylinders like it used to. Of course, this is not true for every sequel in every franchise. Some are still able to be highly engaging outings that stand on par or even surpass their first title, but Little Nightmares as a franchise has something of an issue. It intentionally limits its own mechanics to better sell the experience it's trying to sell, and adding too many new features risks losing what these games are supposed to be all about, that being small children navigating a huge hostile world that is at best apathetic to their struggles, but more often than not is actually trying to snuff them out, and them only having their wits and whatever loose objects they have to hand to be able to defend themselves. And that's even if defense is feasible, most of the time you just have to run away. So I did wonder, what can they possibly add to the formula that will warrant a third game rather than just, say, a DLC pack? I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but that's kind of where my brain was at when I first heard the announcement. I was excited, but a little bit worried. Little Nightmares 3 is the fourth game in the franchise in terms of release order, though where it sits on the Little Nightmares timeline is anyone's guess. The writers for this series seem to be quite happy to come up with stories, but then tell them backwards, since Very Little Nightmares is technically the first game in the canon, with it then going to 2, then to 1, so Little Nightmares 3 might again be a prequel to events, though this time around we've moved away from Six as a character, which I feel is for the best. We've kind of done most of the stuff we can do with her. Outside of her returning as maybe a proper boss later in the series, I don't think we need to see her again. Something that did concern me was that during development the game faced a significant delay. Now, I knew the game would have multiplayer as a core element, which naturally needs a lot of testing, and for the solo players you also have to make sure that the companion AI that's going to replace another player is up to snuff. So I wasn't cross about it, I was just worried that this possibly meant they bit off more than they could chew. Given that the third game looks, feels and plays exactly like the first two games, I have to assume that it was the multiplayer element that caused the most issues, but then again, that's not enough to deter me. I do really like this series quite a lot, it's had a special place in my heart since its inception, and I expect by 2030 when we get Little Nightmares 4, I'll still be there waiting passionately for another 4 hours of wandering through disproportionate facilities and dodging some deeply upsetting monsters. If or more likely when I sound a little bit jaded throughout this video, it's because Little Nightmares games mostly see very minor changes in terms of core mechanics, and at best the series has taught me to expect maybe 3 or 4 new things, or at least altered things for new games. Maybe some gimmicks throughout the levels, but in terms of consistent new features, we usually only get 1 or 2 changes to justify the new game, and it is a little bit like, you know, I'm starting to see through the veneer. Most everything else is the game just taking something it did originally and either removing it entirely or altering how it works. A good example is keys. In Little Nightmares 1, you had to physically carry keys from one place to another by keeping hold of the shoulder button, which kind of added nothing to the experience. It just sort of artificially made some bits feel a bit more tense, but it was mostly just awkward, so Little Nightmares going, okay, you don't have to do that anymore, we're just gonna let you pocket the key, is an idea in the same way that a cucumber is a dildo. I mean, sure, it's better than the cactus you were using, but it's kind of weird you had to find it out the hard way. The only consistent new mechanic that Little Nightmares 2 added to the series was giving you an extra person to help you solve some puzzles. So I have to admit, going into Little Nightmares 3, I wasn't expecting a whole lot. I hardly believed the game would be able to justify itself as a full game rather than just, say, an expansion. Come on, Ronica, you can save being a miserable dickhead until the main main part of this review at the very least. This is still the intro after all. Little Nightmares as a series is sort of the opposite affair to our last subjects, Deliver Us the Moon and Deliver Us Mars. It's very gameplay heavy without a direct hands-on approach to the story. It's more draped in symbolism and suggestion. This means we'll be primarily focusing on how the game handles said gameplay. We will touch on the story towards the end and there will be spoilers, I'll put up a warning there, but this is mostly going to be a gameplay thing, talking about the new mechanics and how they add to the experience or subtract from it. So I welcome you, my friends, enemies and all little nightmarish entities, to today's review. I'm Ronica, and for Halloween we're going to be diving into one of the only horror games I can play without completely wussing out. So grab your favourite assorted snacks and make sure that monster under your bed doesn't have to go pee-pee as we dive into the long-awaited Little Nightmares 3. Drop a like on the video if you end up enjoying yourself, leave a comment if you feel so inclined, and sub for more stuff. I do reviews and gameplay stuff from time to time, so if that's of any interest to you newbies, please consider sticking around. I'd appreciate it. Anyway, that's the intro finally done. I love you all. Let's begin. Little Nightmares 3 is best described as Little Nightmares Here's More Edition. It's the usual puzzle game with a horror aesthetic that I love, and whilst I will be fairly dismissive of the game throughout this entire video, I will say that it still mostly feels like Little Nightmares, which is good because, as you all know, I'm a fan of the first two games. Fundamentally, it is basically the same thing again, but with a couple of small evolutions here and there. Well, one small evolution and one rather big evolution, but that big one is kind of debatable given its implementation, but we'll get there when we get there. Like Little Nightmares 2, we have two characters facing a big scary world rather than just one character facing a big scary world, and both characters have a unique tool that they can produce to handle specific situations. At the start of a run or when you're replaying a chapter, you can choose which character you want to be, and while certain specifics will shift as a result of this choice, the overall experience is basically the same. We will of course look at both of the characters and their tools in a minute, but first and foremost, let's talk about the controls. We have the usual movement being the left stick and camera being the right stick, as is tradition. We can sprint by holding square as we run. We can crouch with L2, which also doubles as our sneaking for passing by certain hostile entities. If you press R2 in front of a loose physics object, of which there are many, you can pick it up, and by pressing X or holding it for a while, you can throw it a short distance or a long distance. Otherwise, X is the jump button. When you are throwing something, keep an eye on your character. If it looks like they're aiming at something, that's usually code for this is where you want to throw the thing, which I always liked. It's enough of a hint to keep you on track, but if you're not paying attention, you could easily miss it. If you press triangle, you'll call over your NPC partner, either just to get you both in the same space, or so you can guide them towards an obstacle that they specifically need to handle with their tool of choice. If you press circle, your character will pull out their own tool, and whilst it's drawn, pressing R2 now uses it rather than grab stuff. It's worth mentioning that jumping with tools out is sort of a no-go, so you better put them away before chase scenes or platforming segments, which again you do with circle, since if you don't you'll only slow yourself down. Also, it's worth noting that Lo, the boy in the beaked mask, can run with his tool out, his tool being a bow and arrow, but the girl alone with her big wrench cannot. I honestly couldn't tell you why that's the way things work. I don't think that makes any real sense even in the context of the game, but apparently that's the system we have to work with. I feel that of the three console games, Little Nightmares 3 controls the best, but do keep in mind that noticeable differences in how the games feel has always been incredibly minor. They basically perfected everything in the first game, so now there's not really anywhere up to go. One significant movement difference, 2 made over 1 for example, was that now when crossing, say, a really narrow beam, you sort of lock on and can't fall off the sides. Because of the game's forced perspective, this does lead to fewer deaths that just feel like bullshit. So compared to Little Nightmares 1, Little Nightmares 2 felt a lot fairer right off the bat. The problem is Little Nightmares 2 basically fixed everything that needed to be fixed. Little Nightmares 3 has kept all of those changes, and the movement does feel ever so slightly smoother, but that could just be wishful thinking on my part. Again, the first game all but nailed this aspect, so what could you really do that wouldn't ultimately make it worse rather than better? I'd also say that overall the game does feel quite responsive. Grabbing items feels a little more accurate than last time. The game only bullshit defed me in one sequence when it decided that me pressing the jump button on a solid ground wasn't good enough for it, and I think generally it runs slightly better, but then again, major lags or graphical fuck-ups have never really been a huge problem for this franchise, so I haven't really got anything in the series to compare it to. Generally speaking, I find the Little Nightmares games to be well optimized, and that's undeniably a good thing. There really isn't a whole lot wrong with how these games work and how they play. I think the most consistent problem I've had with Little Nightmares games is during chase sequences, sometimes the game just doesn't like to register you pressing the jump button, and it's like, I don't know why that happens, but I definitely pressed the button before I got to the edge of this ledge, but for some reason that just wasn't good enough for the game. There were a couple more moments of Little Nightmares 3 behaving poorly, but that's a separate issue that we're going to tackle later. For now, I'll just say that the game is mostly reliable, just as all the former titles were. You could, of course, argue that since the core mechanical differences are so minor, that Little Nightmares 3 doesn't warrant being a fully fledged sequel, and should have instead been, say, DLC, like an expansion pack of some sort. I would find it hard to necessarily disagree with such a thought pattern, though to offer Bandai Namco credit, they retailed the game for 35 quid rather than the industry standard starter price of 70, though it does for some reason have a digital deluxe edition, which is just gatekeeping extra content, which can immediately fuck right off. But generally speaking, I'm not against games with DLC. I don't even mind paying for more to get more, that's fine, but you just fucking came out, Little Nightmares 3. Why the fuck are you artificially dividing yourself up for more money? I know for a lot of people that this practice has become so normalised to a point where you don't even bat an eye anymore, but you really should be batting an eye. Say it with me, please. Fuck the game industry and its artificial divvying up launch day content to make an extra pile of money next to the first pile of money. I admit that's a bit of a mouthful. It's avaricious, it's insulting, and the executive that made this decision could walk off into the ocean tomorrow and the world would be a better place. Plus, they'd probably get eaten by sea creatures or something, and therefore would contribute the first worthwhile thing of their lives to this world. Anyway, back to Little Nightmares 3. Little Nightmares 3's two main claims to fame are the duo protagonists and the multiplayer feature. In the second game, we saw what was no doubt the inspiration for this idea, as Mono, the protagonist of that game, had Six, the protagonist of the former game, as an NPC tag-along for a lot of the ride, but she was frequently separated from us at various points, and neither really had any specific skill that made them better or worse at traversing the world, so individually they weren't really bringing anything to the table. They were just two kids facing the world rather than one. It often just felt like an excuse to design some puzzles in such a way that they needed two people rather than one, but Little Nightmares 3 decided to take a slightly different approach by giving both characters their aforementioned tools. First of all, we have Lo, the boy in the beaked mask. He has a bow and arrow that he can shoot things with, like weak ropes or cracked glass or out of reach buttons, and sometimes even enemies. It's basically just a throwing mechanic redressed though, as you don't really aim. As long as Lo is near something that he recognises as a target, he'll automatically take aim if the bow is drawn, and all you have to do is press the shoulder button to let fly your arrow. Practically speaking, most of the time the only difference is we now don't have to search the environment for a loose physics object to throw at stuff. This is of course a more convenient setup, but don't worry, I saw your ears perk up when I told you the bow could damage enemies, so let me explain that a little bit. It can damage small enemies, nothing larger than an average sized dog, but it does make us feel a bit less helpless, which I could see as being either a good or bad thing. Good because it's a mechanical representation of how we as an audience have become more familiar with this game and this world, and thus can now stand our ground when it bares its teeth, but bad because a feeling of helplessness is so important to the feel of Little Nightmares that giving us easy access to a weapon, even a one that's only effective against certain things, does make the world feel just a little bit less threatening, and thus we lose some of the charm that makes these games what they are. I am thankful enough that we can't use the bow against bigger enemies, by which I mean it's completely ineffective against all of them until randomly later when it's not because the game said so, shut up, but that's an issue we're going to dive into a little bit later, you can count on that. There are also some smaller enemies that aren't exactly receptive to being arrowed, but I still think this poses the very real risk of letting some of that usual Little Nightmares tension go, which you could argue the second game kinda started with the swinging stuff at bullies to bash their skulls in, but even then you needed to have access to a loose physics object that you could drop if you weren't careful, and the timing was way more precise, plus you actually needed to let them close the gap a little bit, which made things feel a lot scarier, and also one enemy literally dodges your swing, so you have to be more careful. The bow sort of loses all of that. Its window of opportunity is far greater, and the distance keeps you out of the danger zone, often to such an extent that you need to actively try to get yourself killed by enemy retaliation. The bow is mostly reliable and responsive, but I did have one issue early on in a room full of bugs where the bow just couldn't lock on properly, and sometimes Lo, despite having an arrow ready, just wouldn't fire it when I told him to. That particular issue fucked me over earlier when I was dealing with the bugs, and then again later when this dude with one hand was chasing me. Still though, it does mostly work alright. The biggest problem you'd have using a bow is that sometimes after you've weakened an enemy, your partner might not be fast enough to get to the rest of them to finish them off. Speaking of partners, let's now talk about Alone, who has a wrench, which is mostly just a club that she uses for breaking things, since the wrench feature is used precisely twice in the opening chapter and then never again. Basically, she is big bonk character. She breaks walls, glass, and heads with a mighty whack of her wrench. Her role in combat is to act as the finisher. Lo will fire his bow, the enemy will take a hit and be left vulnerable, like the flying beetles will fall out of the sky, or the arrow will knock the head off of one of these puppets, which from now on I'm going to be calling the no thank yous, because creepy puppets could go fuck right off. I mean that in a good way, they are genuinely creepy, I really don't like them, and they are the perfect fit for this sort of game. Well done, Little Nightmares. After that, Alone moves in for the kill by smashing them in the face. In the latter setup, she also needs to navigate around the still animated bodies of the no thank yous because they can still grab and kill you. To the game's credit, this is not a horrible idea, and it's not one that suffers from overuse. There are like 3 whole sequences of this in the entire game, and the final one was optional. You could just sneak past these no thank yous if you really want to, and this does mitigate the concern that the game was going to start favouring these call and response combat-esque sequences, but without the same level of tension as the game before. It's not a bad idea on its own, it's just its existence here does take something away from the original vibes of the series, but ironically it also wasn't used as well as it could have been. Lowe's bow is an excuse to have out-of-reach things be reachable, which is only really used uniquely in Little Nightmares 3 a minimal amount of times, I think like twice, possibly? And Alone's wrench just not being used as the tool it is, well, I feel like a trick was missed here. Aside from the battle sequences being a risky direction to take the series in, the actual function of these tools is basically just taking a Little Nightmares 1 or 2 feature, but adding it as a permanent action for a character rather than an environmental contextual one. Again, I don't hate the idea, I just think it's not as well utilised as it could have been. Look, Lowe is fine, his bow works as a bow for the most part. It's consistent in that it's being used for its intended purpose, and it can affect the things it's supposed to affect, until later, when it kind of doesn't. It's Alone's wrench where the problems really start to occur, and again, I need to stress this, it's used as a wrench twice in the opening chapter, and then only as a club for the rest of the game, and this is where I find myself starting to recognise the game's first tentative steps into the realm of inconsistency. I question why they added the wrench feature at all, I just feel like an opportunity was missed here. We could have had maybe some puzzles where we have to use the wrench to loosen and tighten some busted valves to let our partner pass through an area safely, or hell, maybe we could have a couple of sequences where we use the wrench to repair something that we need to walk across. It's just sort of not how the game decided to do things. It's not a deal breaker, it's not some unforgivable gaming trespass, it's just kinda wasted potential. What does run the risk of being a deal breaker in my humblest of opinions is the constant NPC ally presence and what it does to make the world feel less hostile, since now, hey, we've permanently got a friend who's working with us. There isn't even an initial scene of one of the kids running away from the other at first and then deciding, oh, actually, I kinda need your help, so let's work together. We're friends. We start the game as friends and we end the game as friends. Little Nightmares 2 pioneered in the series the idea of the NPC ally, but didn't have it as a constant presence. Six and Mono were separated several times. The game begins with you alone in a forest, which established a feeling of isolation and helplessness that Six alleviated when we found her, but because she and Mono were torn apart a few times throughout our adventure, we had to again sit with that feeling of loneliness and dread that comes with the solitude. This was also a level of inconsistency, mind you, but one that did more to serve the game and its intended feeling rather than impede it. Little Nightmares 3 starts with both characters together, they're already friends, which for the plot it does matter, but mechanically it means we never get to feel alone. The longest we spend physically separated is like 30 seconds, and only because the game decided that we can't pull each other up onto ledges, so we have to find different ways to get A to B to character B. That was not the sentence I wanted to say. So we have to find different ways to get one character from A to B. This is a very artificial method of designing the game's puzzles that I genuinely don't care for. Again, it's not an unforgivable sin or anything, it's just kinda weird. Stuff like this is why I'm hesitant to label the game as a true step forward. Mechanically, it feels like it is sometimes, but thematically, I feel like we've gone the wrong way. Now, narrative-wise, this is a game about two friends facing the world, and you can't really have that with only one person present. I guess technically you could, but we'll get there. It's not that I don't recognise what the game is trying to do, it's that I feel that it's not the best move for a series for which many of its best moments are the ones where you're alone and afraid. It was definitely nice having Six as a partner in Little Nightmares 2 for some moments, since it made the hostile world feel just a little bit safer. It was also nice in the original game that we got to see other kids in the Secrets of the Maw DLC, because it gave us a wider impression that we're not the only ones struggling, but my favourite moments from the series have all been solo based. In the first game we're alone all the time, so it's just chock full of brilliant moments, but the DLC has one of the best heart drop sequences in the entire series in my humblest of opinions. I was sneaking through a dark room when suddenly Roger, the blind janitor, has just sort of stood there, as if he knows I have to come through this room, but he can't really catch me until I slip up and make a noise that draws him over. When I first played it, this moment made me loudly exclaim, "Gah, fuck me sideways." It's a really effective jump scare moment that I think would have been undermined if I had a partner. But Little Nightmares 2, we have to spend some time navigating the school hallways where these rambunctious bully doll things are making a mess, and it's also a great moment largely because, again, we're doing it solo. both of these moments are accentuated because we have to deal with them on our own. Yeah, there are lots of other people on screen, if people is even the right word, but they're definitely not allies. They don't have our best interests at heart. They will attack us the moment we slip up. In Little Nightmares 3 though, our partner is always close by, and they are a constant source of comfort, so this mean, unforgiving world where everything is creepy and just a little bit too big and also very, very hungry just doesn't hit the same. I'll offer this much, it still looks like Little Nightmares. That distinctive art direction where everything looks either mouldy, damp, or like it would smell like 1,000 unwiped bottoms is still here, and I utterly adore the new locales chosen by the devs to be rendered in this dark, surreal fashion. The game still looks and sounds absolutely fantastic. The audio-visual side of things has always done a lot of the work making these games what they are, but here it feels like it's trying to work overtime to compensate for the fundamental loss of that feeling of isolation, which usually makes these locales all the more unsettling. One level is literally a creepy candy factory, and one is a deeply upsetting carnival drenched in rain. The game is clearly keenly aware of what this permanent duo is sacrificing, so it looked at two places that feel perfect to make a dark, twisted version of, and then masterfully brought them to life. These settings aren't overly special or scary by themselves, but the potential lies in all the little details, like the subtle state of disrepair and the oddly sized objects, which all contribute to making these places feel all the more grotesque. I will say though, something the game did far too often for my liking was just give up and throw you into a dark room, because technically that's horror. I mean, look, darkness can contribute, but it should be used sparingly if the world itself is already designed to be unsettling. Sometimes a fully lit room can be far more creepy if designed well. Take for instance the janitor's room in the original Little Nightmares. It looks kind of normal at an initial glance, but it's all wrong. Everything is far too long, the wallpaper is a nice pattern, but it's old and peeling. The bed has these thick leather straps that kind of hold all the mattresses and sheets together, which does make a level of sense. It's one of those, I think they're called Murphy beds, that falls in and out of the wall, but it just looks really, I don't know, unsettling. But the thing that got me the most, there are portraits all over the walls. The janitor is blind, he can't see these, so I can't figure out why they would be there in the first place, or even why the light in his room would be on. It's all kind of oddly cozy, but at the same time, I feel like if I was in this room, I'd never be able to feel comfortable. It's a great setting, and it manages to keep me on edge, even though the room is so bright. I think the sun's right outside the window. At least I would if there was a window. Look, I am a big believer in the idea that the imagination is the best tool for horror, and what we can't see is often scarier than what we can. It's one of the most fundamental things in horror, and low light can help achieve a really good feeling of tension, but don't just flick out the light and walk away. Little Nightmares 3 often just puts you in a dark room, but you've got a torch, so you can navigate. It's not even difficult, and there's very rarely an enemy. Actually, I don't think there's ever any enemies in a dark corridor where you can't see properly. No, wait, tell a lie, there's one area of the game where you're in darkness and you need to avoid some monsters. The only problem is it feels like a rip-off of Little Nightmares 2 when it does this section. You're in this institute and there's this dark room full of doctors who can't see you, but they can hear you. You have to navigate this room with your torch. It took me one attempt to get through here. Compare this, if you will, to Little Nightmares 2. There's a sequence in the hospital section where you have to cross a dark room with your torch, only the dark room is full of enemies. These enemies can see you, but they won't move while the torch is pointed at them because they're terrified of the light. But you need your light to see where you're going, so you have to be really careful about how you navigate this place. It's a fantastic area and it feels so much more interactive. In my first playthrough, I'm pretty sure I also got to the end of this room in one go, but it felt so much more tense because these things could see me and they were just waiting until they felt safe enough to attack. Darkness can be a really great tool for a horror game, but you have to use it well. Little Nightmares 1 used it well, Little Nightmares 2 used it well. Hell, Little Nightmares 2 didn't overuse it like Little Nightmares 1 almost very nearly did. Little Nightmares 3 just doesn't know how to wield it properly. It makes these sections feel more annoying rather than tense. I felt far more uneasy walking down the corridors with low light rather than navigating the rooms without light. Luckily enough, we get more of the former sections than the latter, and when it does said former sections, it does them really well. The world of the nowhere has been brought to life so eerily and beautifully that this game almost succeeds in feeling like a proper Little Nightmares experience. Where it fails is our two protagonists. On the surface, it's business as usual. It's a small child lost in a big scary world type game, and I've said before in videos that unless you're utterly deranged, seeing a kid in danger is far more upsetting than seeing an adult in the same danger, and I think it works even better when we assume the child isn't used to surviving said danger. I think these games work really well when we're a fish out of water, but when it's it's two children who are both quite capable of survival and both feel like they've become accustomed to this world they're stuck in, well, I just kind of feel that concerns start to drain away. Lo and Alone feel like they've been doing this for a long time. They feel oddly well equipped to handle this usually unforgiving world, and again, it could be a commentary on the audience and their comfort with said games after all these years, but I don't think we should ever truly feel comfortable playing a Little Nightmares game. We should always feel unwelcome, like the world isn't here for us and surviving against it is a real accomplishment. The funny thing is, just seeing Lo and Alone have to adapt and learn to survive here would have been much more impressive. The fact that we've kind of reached them at the end of what I assume is a really important arc just, well, I kind of feel like I just started watching a random TV series at season 7. Only the TV series is being hosted on Netflix, which doesn't have the rights to the first 6 seasons, so you can't actually tell what they were doing for all this time. Obviously, the two main characters being as skilled and reliable as they are is to make room for the co-op element. After all, it wouldn't really be much fun if one character was doing everything and the other was just sort of sat in a corner crying. So there is some logic in this being an area where the game actually does consistency fairly well, even if it sometimes feels like it probably shouldn't, but that feels like quite a good segue to start talking about our next point. Let's now talk about the game's big, overarching problem, that problem being of inconsistency. The Little Nightmares games have always had something of a problem with using and forgetting about mechanics, though previously they had felt more structured, the design choices all fit together consistently, and when they did leave something behind, it usually made some amount of sense. To the game's credit, 3 does continue plenty of the Little Nightmares traditions. We still have the low light areas, we still have to push and pull things to create paths, we still have those runaway corridors where the monster chases us, all of which seem to follow very similar layouts, I'm just now noticing that. But the game also just seems to forget what choices it's making sometimes about certain features. I said earlier that Alone's wrench is only used as a wrench twice in the entire game and they're both in the first chapter. That's not hyperbole, that really is as limited as this feature is. We don't have Alone the mechanical expert, we have Alone the barbarian, which is kind of a cool idea I suppose, but I really don't get why this idea was forgotten when it could have served to replace certain previously used design elements in a make sense way. Make sense way? In a sensible way would have been the word I wanted there. This mechanic had so much potential and it's such a shame that the devs seem to have utterly forgotten about it. Then there's how Lo's bow can damage smaller enemies and break loose objects, but then bigger monsters can't be affected at all, like they don't even respond to arrows being shot at them, which I think was the wrong move. A great lesson in picking your battles is the giant monster running towards you as the tiny arrows you're shooting at it doing nothing except getting caught in its undulating hide, but we don't get that. Instead we get nothing because the devs apparently didn't think we might try to shoot the giant monsters with a bow and arrow. But then, suddenly against the final big monster, the arrows are suddenly effective because the game said so. Shut up. This genuinely irritated me. Throughout the entire game up to this point, bigger enemies cannot be hurt by our bow attacks or even acknowledge that they're being shot. But then Big Wiggly Boy happens and all of a sudden he can take damage. I mean, sure, we have to shoot him in the eyes, which are his weak points, but then again, every other monster we've encountered thus far has eyes, which would also be weak points. Well, almost every monster. The dude in the purple suit has no eyes, but that's one exception. We could have made a cool mechanic out of having to blind the monsters and take advantage of the fact that they can't see anymore and sneak around them. Or maybe we could use the bow to slow them down by causing them pain. Of course, this would lead to the game feeling less like a horror title and more like a shooting gallery, but then again, I'm not the one who insisted on the team giving the protags a fucking weapon. Also, it doesn't even consistently work on smaller enemies. This greasy little hand puppet that I'm going to call Nigel can't be hurt by the bow or the wrench despite being the right size. When I first encountered Nigel, he crawled towards me, so I thought, oh okay, another puppet, I know what to do. I got my wrench out, I swung it, and it had no effect. I thought maybe I mistimed it, so I reloaded and tried again, and again, and again. I tried a bunch of times, but eventually I learned the truth. You can't hurt him. The bow can't hurt him either. I feel like the sequence was being inconsistent and therefore unfair. I think the only clue you really get is the fact that Lo doesn't try to attack the thing. But let's say you're playing as Lo. You wouldn't know that, would you? You'd see it run towards you, you'd pull out your bow, but because of the amount of time you actually have to react, you wouldn't notice that there's no ability to lock onto the little fucker. It's also worth noting that Lo sometimes just won't target the things that he can target, so you can't tell if the game is telling you, hey, you can't shoot this, or if the game is just kind of fucking up. This was an inconsistent moment, and thus I felt the game was being entirely unfair. And that's saying something. Little Nightmares games are already fairly happy to one-hit kill the player. They're fine having murder holes everywhere and monsters with questionable reach and POV, but for the most part we didn't have to guess. When we saw something that wasn't us, we knew it was hostile. When we saw something that wasn't us and there wasn't something to swing at it, we knew we had to run away. Because the game's given us weapons, it had to sometimes decide that, oh, by the way, your weapons can't hurt this one, otherwise we can't do the horror scene we want to do. This game feels like it cheats, like it wants to pad the runtime, but rather than say adding another area or some more secrets, it just lies to you. It also doesn't seem to know how it wants to handle the collectibles and extras. First of all, the game says I can view my collectibles from the menu. I cannot. I mean, I can see the costumes there, but those don't update update because those are all premium and I'm not paying extra for them, but I could not see any of the various dolls that I'd found. Secondly, the game is very inconsistent about how it wants to distribute them. The Necropolis, level 1, has 5 dolls to find. Level 2, the Factory, has another 5 dolls to find. So far so good, but level 3, the Carnival, has 8 dolls to find, and also several of these lady statues from the first game that you can break. But then level 4, the Institute, goes back to having 5 dolls, and instead of the statues, it now has several ghosts that you can collect. My main question is, why? I'd get, say, increasing the number of collectibles over time, but Little Nightmares decided that its third level had to have the most out of any of them, but then level 4 would go and have less. Oh, also, whilst all the lady statues and the dolls will be reloaded when you revisit an area, and any collected after a checkpoint will also reappear if you die, the ghosts in the Institute do neither of these things. Again, why? What's the point? I honestly think Little Nightmares 2 did collectibles so much better. You had both the hats and glitching remains to find. Both would stay collected when you reloaded an area, so it was easier to find the things you missed. And the latter of the collectibles unlocked a secret final cutscene as an extra reward for seeking them out. Now, it wasn't much. It was like the reward for 100% completion of Super Mario Sunshine in that it was fairly small and insignificant. But it was something. It was a little extra to reward the player's exploration. Then come to Game 3, its ending isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but there was nothing added as an extra congratulations for seeking out all the dolls and extras, and I would know. I played this game 3 times to make sure I saw everything, but there was just kinda nothing. Now, let's be fair here. Spoiler alert, jump to timestamp to avoid. Spoiler alert, jump to timestamp to avoid. The game's ending is quite good. You've just defeated Wiggles, you're making your way to the final mirror, mirrors being how Alone and Alone travel between these areas, and there's been some build up that Alone doesn't fully trust the mirrors, but I just kind of thought, oh, the mirror thing is Lo's power and it kind of disturbs her, that's completely fair. But then we pass through the mirror and all of a sudden, Alone is pushed back out through the mirror, breaking it in the process. She then pulls a Jedi and fades away before our eyes because she was never a real child. She was a resident of the nowhere. This is a cool twist, it's well hinted at throughout the game, and this ending of Lo losing his only friend actually made me feel a little sad for the two. But then, after the credits, nothing. No reward for finding all the extras, no concept art to view like in the first game, you couldn't see a little expansion to the story like in the second game, there was just nothing to find. I feel like all my extra time was wasted, and I hate the idea that Little Nightmares made me feel like it was a waste of time. This game feels weird. There was effort made to be true to the Little Nightmares formula and vibe, but it keeps making these little errors in judgment that amount to a wider problem. The game feels almost like it wasn't finished properly, and given the heavy delay it faced, that's impressive to use a more diplomatic term. I can't say that I hate the entire game, I simply don't. It's just that it feels like such a weak source entry into the franchise, a franchise that I happen to really love by the way. It had so much potential, but it either couldn't or wouldn't work towards truly reaching it. For every moment that it delivered a true Little Nightmares feeling, there was one where it lost so much of what made the series so amazing. Yes, it nailed the look and feel of the environments, but it connected them in a more fantastical way that I think kind of detracts from the experience because we lose that cohesive feeling world the games previously had. The music is still really well composed, but it's also some of the most forgettable in the entire series. The game got the monster appearances really right, but how we interact with them kinda holds the overall experience back. It gave us plenty of moments of feeling helpless, but it also made our leads far too capable, and it gave us tools which had to arbitrarily not work on certain targets because otherwise the game loses that feeling of us being a tiny bug in a world so much larger than ourselves. The game really did try to be the next big step forward, but when the chips are down, it ended up being more analogous to a moderate sidestep. Only one foot got caught in a small ditch whilst the other was run over by some cunt in a Tesla. Yep, we're doing a multiplayer bit. I wanted to see if anything changed or felt different in this mode, aside from obviously having a stupid human ally rather than a mostly competent NPC. Or at least that's what I intended to do. At time of writing, there's no way to matchmake. You can only invite people from your friends list, if you're on the PS5 anyway, who have the game, but if none of your friends want to fork out 35 quid for a short puzzle game that's basically the same as the first 2 games, then you get to eat shit. I had hoped that there would be at least some local co-op, though in hindsight some of the game's bits wouldn't work quite so well because since both characters aren't always on screen at the same time. If only there was a solution to that problem. Oh wait, it's been solved before. It's called split screen, you cunts. I was actually sort of looking forward to the idea of inviting one of my friends down and playing through the game together, since she hasn't got a PS5, but that's not going to work now, is it? That left me legitimately quite bitter, and I'm already sort of mad that multiplayer has come along to a series that already really didn't need it. But then to have it be such an inferior version of multiplayer, because clearly either the dev team aren't used to working with this type of game, or the publisher just don't give a shit and are hoping this will get more people to buy the game individually, because we all know the game industry doesn't make enough money. I'm sure you could already tell that was sarcasm, but just in case you are slower than a reform voter, that was sarcasm. I have a grand total of one PS5 friend who has the game, and I don't actually know who they are or why we're friends online. It just feels really awkward. It's like the worst amount of awkward. I don't know them enough to want to ask them to play the game, but they're also my only viable option right now if I actually want to talk about the multiplayer. Sadly, my social anxiety is going to prevent me from doing this. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to take issue with the fact that I didn't play the multiplayer again, but honestly, at this point, I truly don't give a shit. Little Nightmares needs multiplayer the same way I need another gout flare-up. Little Nightmares 3 feels almost confused about what it is, what it wants to be, and how it should go about being it. The series has always been ambiguous, trading in a direct story for a narrative communicated entirely via symbolism, but it's never felt like this before. It never felt like it just forgot what it was doing, or that it needed to be direct about anything aside from the world we're in being horrific and dangerous. I feel the need to point this much out. I don't hate this game. I did come close a couple times though, and that's really not good. There are plenty of things that I like about this game. I like some of the mechanical ideas it had. The whole bow and arrow thing is kinda cool, and I would have liked to see more stuff done with that. The same goes for the wrench. I love the idea. I just wish we got to use it as a wrench more throughout the game. The character and monster designs do feel a little bit lesser than what we've seen before, but they're still Little Nightmares entities. They still feel like Little Nightmares creatures, and that's perfect. The music, the atmosphere, it's all still there. There is still Little Nightmares here in this Little Nightmares game. It's just there's also plenty that irks me. I will admit that I don't love that the carnival guests are apparently called the Herd. I feel like it would work better if they were called the carnival goers or the visitors, since whilst these games are drenched in suggestion, the names of their entities have always been a bit more neutral on the surface. I mean, look at what we had before. We had the janitor, the chefs, the guests, the lady, the granny, the hunter, the teacher, the bullies, the doctor, the patients, the viewers, the thin man, the craftsman, the butler, the pretender. Okay, this one still leans more towards being monstrous, but I don't know, it still feels kind of okay. But Little Nightmares 3 once again feels inconsistent about this approach. Sure, we've got the supervisor, the puppets, and the nurses. They all follow the original naming convention, but then we've got the kin, the herd, and the monster baby, and I don't know why, but these names just feel lesser. Oh wait, no, I do know why. It's because these names have lost that sense of neutrality. They lean more into just being sinister, which doesn't leave enough to the imagination, at least for two of those names anyway. The kin kind of escapes this because he's the dude with the puppet for a hand. His name just doesn't make sense and feels silly. The puppeteer would have fit better. Yeah, that one does lean more into being sinister anyway, but it still maintains a sense of normality given the fact that he appears in the carnival. You might find puppets at a carnival, so you'll find a puppeteer. The context of his area would have made that name more sensible. Look, you could see this as another case of me making mountains out of molehills, like I did with the air canisters in Deliver Us the Moon, or the movement speed back in Blackwood Crossing, but I would say that not only does this time it feel more warranted, I would also like to remind you of something I've said before in videos, that you should never underestimate how the littlest things can change the overall experience, the overall vibe. Little Nightmares' atmosphere is so effective because the world it creates is full of familiar things and settings, but twisted into darker, more unwelcoming versions of themselves. Even little details like the chairs and general furniture feel slightly wrong, and the names of the hostile entities never needed to try hard. When I say janitor, what do you picture? You probably see something like a human janitor with a mop in a jumpsuit. When I say doctor, you probably envision a physician tending to the sick. When I say butler, you probably think of a besooted gentleman wearing a suit. I didn't need to say besooted wearing a suit, that was redundant. But when I say monster baby, you probably think of a big monstrous baby. Or when I say a herd, you think of a non-human collection of creatures. In both cases, when you hear these names, you're already imagining something non-human, which I feel like it hurts the game despite none of these names ever appearing in the game. They'll only appear if you look them up. But it's just a little detail that makes Little Nightmares 3 feel just worse than the original games. And I honestly don't even know what you'd imagine when I said the kin. Like, I don't know. That's the problem. I just don't know what to think. In a weird way, this naming convention is kind of reflective of the game's wider issues. It's very inconsistent. I know I've said that word a lot in this review, but that's just what it is. I've said already, it's not an awful game, it's just really hard to justify its existence. I really can't bring myself to recommend anyone drop 35 quid on this game. No, sorry, let me retract that statement slightly. I can't bring myself to recommend anyone drop 35 quid on the starting edition of this game, because it has an extra £10 worth of DLC, which equates to 2 extra levels. First of all, that should surely mean that the base game should be £20 because it's 4 levels. But secondly, fuck that. Fuck this stupid business practice. The game just came out. If it has DLC already, that means that stuff was carved out of the main game and is now being sold back to you at a premium. Sorry, there's just no way that this isn't gonna feel like a scam to me. Wait, no, I'm not sorry. Fuck off, Bandai Namco. The worst part is I did toy with the idea of getting it, but then I realised something. I really didn't want to play more of Little Nightmares 3. I'd rather play 1 or 2 or Very. Yeah, I even recommend the mobile tie-in game over this big third release. For a third time, I will reiterate, I don't hate this game. It's not a bad game in and of itself, it's just unfortunately in the position of having to be compared to the first 2 games in the series, which some might call unfair, but those people are idiots because it is basically the same fucking game with only a couple of specifics switched up. This is probably going to be another one of those, if it goes on sale, then I suppose maybe pick it up, but the first 2 games haven't gone anywhere. The first 2 games are still really good. It does have some solid potential, it does have a genuinely decent ending that I really liked. It's even got some nice intrigue scattered throughout the game, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't do enough to justify its own existence. It feels confused, almost directionless at times, and the whole pick your player gimmick is kind of promising to an extent. It wasn't done the best it could have been, and I'm still not entirely convinced that it even belongs in a Little Nightmares game at all. I really wanted to like this game. I really want to like all the games that I play. I don't sit here hoping to be disappointed and miserable. That's not the point of playing video games. I was ready to love Little Nightmares 3. Instead, I feel very lukewarm towards it. Well, that was a bad start to my Halloween. I'm gonna go and eat all the sweets that I pretended to buy for the trick-or-treaters and rewatch Event Horizon for some entertainment. Thank you so much for watching, it really does mean the world to me. Be sure to leave a like and a comment if you feel so inclined, and I do hope we'll see you here again in the future. So, until next time, I love you all, take care, put on your costume, and have a very creepy evening.